Please welcome the panel. We're going to talk about the shape of the world today and what it means for Canada. We're probably going to talk about Canadian agriculture a little bit less than what you've heard so far. But for us to understand Canada's place in the world, we first need to understand where the world is. So, Aaron, I'm going to go to you first. Aaron, how do you describe the world today?
Thanks, Tyler. Easy question. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for having me. Look, it's an unsettled world, right? I think we're living through very uncertain times. The situation is fluid. It is anxiety-inducing. It's uncomfortable. In many respects, I think Canadians in particular are feeling a little bit hurt right now, and we're trying to ascertain what all of this noise and disruption signals and where we're headed in the long term. And I think it is unsettled and uncertain by design. It's obvious that we are sort of in a moment now of transition and of pivot from a system that I think we were all quite familiar with and comfortable working in, that had prevailed, at least in sort of the international trade space, for several decades. And it is increasingly clear that that system is not going to persist entirely in the manner in which it had been ticking along, and it is going to be replaced by something, and the nature of the something, I think at this point in time, remains a little bit undetermined. As I said, I think some of that disruption is very intentional, right? And I think it's important to realize that the president and his administration and those around him, they are playing multiple games at the same time. And there is a certain amount of what they're doing that is disruption for disruption's sake. I do firmly believe that they have been and are comfortable being actors who inject a certain amount of uncertainty into a system that is otherwise stable, and then they try to profit from the disorder that creates. They sort of shake the trees, they see what they can shake out of the trees, and they're quite happy to pick those things up, put them in their pocket, but there's not necessarily a bigger picture or a grander game afoot than that. I do think, though, that operating in parallel to that is what I think could reasonably be described as there is a coherent economic philosophy and an economic vision that is underpinning a lot of what the president is doing right now. It may not be an economic vision that is compelling to us. It may not be an economic vision that we believe in the long run is going to be held up as successful, but it does hang together. This idea that you can leverage tariffs in order to generate revenue for projects that are important to you, that you can leverage those same tariffs in order to create incentives for the repatriation of manufacturing jobs from overseas back to the United States, that you can make yourself more robust and resilient from the standpoint of your strategic industries, and that you can create jobs for Americans, and that you can simply make yourself less reliant on the world. There is a vision there that sort of hangs together, and I think a lot of what this administration is doing is built on the foundation of a fundamental belief that this is all going to work out in the long run. And there's a lot, I think, that is going to need to happen before we'll be in a position to sort of assess whether this has been successful. I mean, just to sort of encapsulate it, right now, we are waiting for an announcement around potential 25% tariffs or 10% on energy that have been deferred until roughly March 4th. Related to border and fentanyl. There are some tariffs on steel and aluminum that are being threatened around March 12th. There are a variety of studies and investigations that U.S. departments and agencies have been instructed to undertake by the President through his America First Trade Policy Memorandum. Those reports and the associated recommendations are expected back by April 1st. There is ongoing work to look at this reciprocal trade analysis, 180 days from February 13th or so, which takes us to about the beginning of August. And then there are threatened sort of in-passing tariffs on things like semiconductors or autos or softwood lumber or whatever the case may be that are mooted to potentially be coming sometime in mid-April. And if you think that's the end of the list, I would encourage you not to get your hopes up. I think we're going to be going through this repeatedly over the course of the next several years as this administration test drives some of these economic policies. There's a lot that the federal government is doing. I think some of it is directed at the U.S., both from an advocacy standpoint and an education standpoint to important people in the U.S. A lot of it is focused domestically. How best do we mitigate the threat to Canadian industry? How do we ensure that we're offering the best possible opportunities for Canadian businesses here at home? How do we diversify their opportunities around the world and give them the supports that they need in order to successfully pursue those opportunities? And then when the rubber hits the road and the seas get really, really rough, to mix two metaphors that don't mix very well, what are the supports that industries are going to need in order to kind of get through this immediate short-term period? And so my team, like a lot of officials in Ottawa, is extraordinarily busy these days running down different issues, different possibilities, recommendations, and analysis so that the government is equipped with the information they need to make the decisions that they have to make on behalf of Canada. So there's a lot happening. In addition to being disruptive, it is also, I think, increasingly tiring for everybody.
So that tiring world, Aaron, is that President Trump's world, or is that a world that's been going through change and chaos for a long time that's built up to this moment?
Well, I mean, it is President Trump's world in a lot of ways, I think, but it is a world that he shares with all of us, and so I wouldn't want to yield the stage to him. I think there are certain trend lines that have been going on for a long time, and if you said, well, look, the WTO isn't what it used to be, and that's not President Trump's fault, it's not something that he's created since November, I wouldn't argue with you. But I would suggest that what we're dealing with right now is of an order of magnitude sort of above and beyond the change that you would otherwise have predicted if you were just looking at the trend lines over a long time. This is like a very serious systems disruption, and I think it's going to take a little while for it to play out.
So Fen, how much of that systems disruption is a threat to Canada, and how much of a threat is it?
Great question, but tariffs are not the 10th Mountain Brigade, which sits in Fort Drum about 2 hours south of here. And if Donald Trump wanted to really take Canada over, I dare say it would be a lot easier than taking Panama, because the 10th Mountain Brigade could come up the 416, and the only resistance they would encounter would be some potholes and some snowbanks in their effort to take over the national capital of Canada. We will know in a week's time what's in store for us and whether Donald Trump is going to follow through on 25% tariffs on everything we export, with the exception of energy, which will be subject to a 10% tariff. Now, we have seen this movie before, but I dare say most of you weren't around in 1922 when Congress invoked the Ford-Montgomery Act that imposed 40% tariffs on the United States trading partners, that were followed 8 years later in 1930 by the Smoot-Hawley tariffs that I dare say everybody knows about, which was another 20%. And those tariffs were intended to protect, and there's a bit of deja vu here, the developing automobile industry in the United States from European competition. These were the days of the Model T Ford, and also U.S. agriculture. There's no question that if Trump follows through, it's going to be very painful for Canada. And Trevor Tomby, who is an economist out in Calgary, who's done some very fine work, has projected that the GDP loss or contraction will be about 4% of GDP if he follows through with all of these tariffs. And that's a bit like what our previous speaker was speaking about when he talked about COVID. That would be the same sort of shock to the Canadian economy as we had during COVID. Is it an existential threat? No. Will it be painful? Yes. But the question I ask is, how painful for how long, and what else could he do to us? Now, tariffs are a spectrum of economic measures that Trump could potentially escalate. I mean, if he wanted to, he could impose embargoes on Canadian exports. He could restrict Canadian businesses from doing business across the border. He could also perhaps put financial restrictions on Canadian pension funds and other major corporations that are major equity holders in the United States. But is he going to do that? No, it would be suicidal. First of all, any kind of embargo would drive commodity prices through the roof. And secondly, any sort of effort to hit us on financial services, I mean, bear in mind, some of our banks, some of our pension funds are the biggest players, not just in the United States, but globally. There would be massive capital flight from the United States. And Donald Trump may be reckless, he may be uninformed, he may not be very good with numbers, but he's not politically suicidal. This brings me to what I would say is perhaps a small piece of good news. Whatever he does and decides to do, and I think there will be tariffs coming, time is not on his side for the following reason. Inflation is going up 3%. He hits us and the Mexicans with tariffs. Everything from the price of avocados to the price of bread is going to go up. I just came back from California, and people were complaining in the grocery line more than once when I was standing in the grocery line about the cost of food and the price of eggs. And so he is going to have a big problem on his hands, and Congress, that has been relatively quiescent, is going to be in an uproar, not just about price increases, because tariffs will be inflationary, but secondly, there are going to be job losses. And if any of you have been following Flavio Volpe, he says, you know, you put 25% tariffs on the supply chains and auto parts going across the border, the big three are going to be shutting down sooner rather than later, and people are going to be out of work. And those are in key red states that delivered the election to Donald Trump. There's another thing that's on our side. Trump is invoking those tariffs under the 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which, if you're having trouble sleeping at night, you can just Google it and read it. But he doesn't have an indefinite hunting license with tariffs. He's going to have to report back to Congress in 120 days. Congress has the power to revoke actions taken under that authority. There are also efforts underway to challenge tariffs, and there will be more efforts in the courts. And if you look at court decisions, Supreme Court decisions, because that's probably where it's going to end up, if you look at Supreme Court decisions, when the executive has invoked the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, the Supreme Court has been, and it's usually when the United States applies sanctions, the Supreme Court has been trying to dial back on some of that executive authority. So when I say time is on our side, it's for the following reason. Markets are going to react. We're going to see, I think, a huge market reaction if he follows through on Monday. The courts will eventually make a decision. Now, whether he decides to abide by a negative decision or not will remain to be seen. But I think more importantly, Congress, which has been sleepy and quiescent in Trump's actions and is still reeling from a lot of other things that he's doing, is going to finally wake up to the fact that in less than 2 years, when there are congressional elections, these guys are going to be out of a job because people are standing in bread lines and are not able to pay their grocery bills because of rising inflation. So that's the little piece of potentially good news, that tariffs, yes. How long, I'm not sure, but it's not going to be indefinite.
So, Paul, if you'll indulge me, I'm going to pivot from the questions we agreed to earlier already, if that's going to be okay with you, to say, like, there's a lot of discussion about tariffs, but that's not all that's going on in the world today. So how do you separate kind of what's in front of us from tariffs to the broader geopolitical disruption, volatility, for lack of a better word?
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks for the invitation. Great to see people again. And I'm going to channel what Nick said earlier. Check the news just before you present if you're talking about these topics. And there is something that happened today that I'm actually going to build into what I say here that's maybe below the radar for you. So I would describe it as 2/3 global change that's going on here, 1/3 Trump administration and US Congress isolationism, America first, and then a failure of Canada to get it right. So it's the combination of those three things. On the first one, it was already mentioned, globalization, demographic change, a lot of things going on there, the rise of China, India, the BRICS. So that, that's well known. The US is no longer willing to play the cop anymore. It can't probably play the cop globally, and it's not willing to anyway. So that's gone, right? That kind of predictable environment is over. And then as Aaron mentioned, as a result, things like the WTO are quickly eroding in terms of how they're able to manage this shift. I would add one other thing to that, and that's the rise of technologies. So the kind of just intangibles, the cross-border things, now of course supercharged by AI and amplified this kind of rapid change. Then on the Trump administration side, so their responsibility in this crisis for Canada, and I would say it is a crisis. I think Fenn's right that it's positive and negative, but to me this is an existential wake-up call that Canada's needed. It's a little bit like that show, Scared Straight. Finally, Canada was taken into the prison to show how bad things can be, right? Like we're scared straight here, right? We've been kind of asleep at the switch for a while. So why is it so nasty south of the border? This is an America First thing that's congressional, it's deep, it's Republicans and Democrats. It's not just Trump, but Trump has a style that is super aggressive, super divisive, tactical, confuse, create uncertainty. That plays to his tactical advantage for negotiating. He's going to keep doing it. And the example that I wanted to note that just happened today was talk of whether Canada should remain in the Five Eyes agreement, which is the core intelligence agreement between the five largest Anglophone countries. No one would have assumed that this would happen, right? The assumption was probably the opposite. Five Eyes is going to be more important than ever, right? So he's trying to create total chaos for Canada. Final point, and everything will be linked. NATO, spending, borders, drugs, money laundering, it's all on the table, right? There is no separation. Final point on what Canada got wrong. It's kind of like a black swan for Canada. If you'd added up all the ingredients, we knew it could happen, but we were in denial that it would happen. But it has happened. And so all the conditions are there, and it means a hard pivot for Canada is absolutely essential, but I think we're kind of getting at it, and I'll unpack some of that later.
So Aaron has to go, but before Aaron goes, I will give him an opportunity to say, what are the signs, Aaron, you can point to that we have been scared straight and that there is some pivot underway and we're learning lessons from this moment that's in front of us today?
I think there's lots of specific examples that you could point to that I think the message is sinking in for us. I would say that the unity that's been displayed, I think, between the Prime Minister and the Premiers, between federal and provincial and territorial officials over the last few weeks, despite how high the stakes are, the willingness to sort of hang together and to get this right is really remarkable. And I think there's a real opportunity here, I think, to address some of the interprovincial trade barriers that have held this country back for a very, very long time. And everything that I can sense is that this is real. We have to, I think, take advantage of the crisis that we're in to get this right, because it's probably one of the biggest things that we can do to help offset some of the risks that we're facing. But I don't think that's the only example, right? I think there's a recognition that we have allowed ourselves to be too reliant upon a single partnership, that we have allowed ourselves to become complacent in terms of how we manage ourselves as a country outside the bounds of that relationship in particular. And I think there's a recognition that the mechanics and the tools that we would normally rely on to resolve this situation, like sitting down at a negotiating table and simply reaching a new accommodation and a new compromise, have some very, very serious limitations, and that we're going to need to think creatively about how we manage ourselves out of this situation. But that said, I'm pretty confident that when we come out of it, and we will come out of it, we'll come out of it as a stronger country than we were when we went into it.
So we'll thank Aaron for his time. He has to go to another meeting, and don't normally have the opportunity to talk about a panelist when he's no longer on the stage and can respond. But I will maybe quibble with Aaron's comment. Like, if the point that we're at, and I'm going to set this up, John, for you to answer after. If the point that we're at is only that we have recognized that we need to change, it seems like we're many weeks kind of past the point when we have recognized that we need to change, and maybe we should be at the point when we should be changing things. And so my question to you, John, is kind of, do we have the leadership to navigate this period of uncertainty? What will it take to actually drive change? How do you see this unfolding up until the point that maybe we've got tariffs in March, maybe we don't, maybe it's April, maybe it's never? What are we going to do?
Yeah, I'd be cautious of not getting too hysterical about the threat. And what is critical with Donald Trump is to understand the difference between signal and noise. And as much as we tell ourselves don't respond to the noise, we're all responding to the noise. And if you look at global reflections on which countries have responded best and worst to Donald Trump in the first number of weeks, Canada is down near the bottom. The world is watching us kind of run around in hysterics, hair on fire, delegations, plural, 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 going to Washington saying, we speak for Canada, when none of them do, and everyone knows that. It's a moment to take a breath and say, okay, what's the difference here between signal and noise? What is within our control? What can we respond to? And how do we respond in our self-interest, which is entirely what I think the Trump administration expects us to do. They're not out to destroy Canada. They're certainly not out to fence point to undermine themselves. And economic self-interest will guide the Trump administration through the coming weeks and months. So we can do the math on that. Yes, this is enormously challenging, and this will come with consequences to the downside for Canada. But let's keep calm and think our way through this and be responding to the signals and not the noise. Now, to the leadership question, obviously we don't have the leadership we need in the country, in that we have a government that is not only disliked and unrespected by the Trump administration, it's got a ticking clock on it. I don't say any of that out of derision for the government. It's kind of plain as day, and we're not going to have a fully legitimate government until, as Nick said, at least May, probably Parliament, even in the best case scenario, probably not sitting before June. So all of that means we've got a few months of a bit of choppiness on the leadership front. Add to that right now we are dealing with a very centralized U.S. government, which is partly just because of the confluence of political change in the United States. But we're seeing a U.S. administration, but a U.S. government more broadly, operate with a singular focus in ways that hasn't been common through the decades. And that is going to require Canada, which is a federation, to respond with or respond with more of a singular focus than we're normally used to. So that's going to require whoever is Prime Minister specifically to ride herd with the provinces and probably with other parts of Canada, and speak up for Canadians, not as like a big Team Canada jamboree approach, although that's necessary, but to show that singular leadership that we're not going to have, unfortunately, until June, but that will come. The world's not going to end between here and June. So with that in mind, when we get through whatever number of months it is, we are going to need, and hopefully the election clarifies this, a much clearer economic strategy for the country. And hopefully we have some choices on the table for Canadians to decide. This is going to be as interesting an election and, as probably we've seen since 1988 in terms of that kind of choice. And hopefully we as Canadians can make that choice and empower a government to say this is where we need to go over the coming years economically. And that includes the options that have been talked about here today in terms of diversification. So we've published a report today out of RBC Thought Leadership called Food First, which looks at agri-food. So I'm very grateful to be able to talk a bit about this here today with the sector, looking at the agri-food sector, 10% of our GDP, and what's at play here. It has become, in a very interesting way, more dependent on the U.S. market over the last 20 years than I think most Canadians recognize. Kudos to the sector for seizing on U.S. growth, seizing on market opportunities, great economic returns and productivity returns for that, but also risks, as we're all aware of today. This isn't just about steel and aluminum. It is about agri-food as well. So how do we take this moment as a bit of a wake-up call and say, let's keep our focus, or keep a focus on the United States, because we will continue to rely for most of our trade from the United States for probably most of our lifetimes. But the growth of our exports can come disproportionately from non-U.S. sources, and should, over the next 25 years. And this is an important moment for Canadians to appreciate how the world is changing. And in simple terms, I like to divide it between older and inward and younger and outward. Older societies tend not to trade because they produce less, they consume more. Younger societies produce more and therefore will trade more. So of course, we're aging, but so is the United States, so is Europe. Let's continue to trade with them. But let's think more and more about the younger parts of the world, the more growth-driven parts of the world, Asia, obviously, Africa, Middle East, Latin America, where there is huge opportunities for us. So as our report gets into they're known as the CIA regions, China, India, and ASEAN, has gone from middle class, so big consumers of agri-food, from 150 million to 1.5 billion just over the last 25 years. That's going probably to 2.5 billion by the 2030s. We have access to those markets of varying degrees, but those markets buy Canadian agri-food products. How do we lean more into those opportunities while managing our relationship with the United States over the next 5+ years? So we've done some modeling on this with BCG, and estimate Canada has, we can add $44 billion to our agri-food exports by getting back to where we were, not by doing anything more than getting back to where we were. Because over the last 25 years, and I'll wrap up with this point, while we've been focused on that U.S. opportunity, we've gone from 5th place to 7th place in terms of global exports. And if we stay on current course, our modeling shows we'll go to 9th place by 2035. So if we just get back to 5th place by the middle of the 2030s, $44 billion, which is more than all of our steel and iron exports. So a huge opportunity for Canada. Hope we can talk about the investments that we're going to need to make in ports, in rail, in global marketing of our agri-food, in 5G technology for our farmers. Lots of opportunities here. Hopefully that's among the choice set for Canadians in the coming months. Are we going to make those investments now? And how are we going to make those investments and then get on with it?
Fen, what else do you think that we need to do to strengthen Canada's position in the world today? I mean, what people talk about defense spending, but like go beyond that. John talked about how we've fallen as an ag export nation, but by many measures, we should be out of the G7 today. What does it take for Canada to regain a leadership position?
Well, I think it does come down to strengthening the economy. And right now, a lot of discussion around interprovincial trade, removing those barriers as sort of the holy grail of recouping the 4% we may lose with 25% tariffs. I have to say I'm somewhat skeptical because the real barriers to trade are not necessarily restrictions on tractor rigs or where you can buy your beer. It's the proverbial beer can on top of the iceberg, and it's what you don't see that presents the major barriers. And those are licensing requirements for laborers and unions, let's be blunt, in different provinces, and public procurement. Last year, Doug Ford introduced something called the Ontario Public Procurement Act 2024. If you're having a sleepless night, look it up. And what does it require? Publicly funded entities, hospitals, schools, not just government itself. They have to procure and buy local. That's a barrier to trade. Here in Ottawa, if you're an electrician, if you want to work on the other side of the river, or if you're a plumber, you have to pay a license to the Régie de Bâtiment, which is the Quebec Building Association. And you also have to join the electricians union and also pay a licensing fee, and there may be exams that you have to pass as well. Those are substantial barriers to trade, and at the end of the day, the consumer or the taxpayer ends up paying more. Our leaders can, I don't like to get too colloquial, but they can suck and blow, but at the end of the day, they're going to have to get rid of things that help them get elected. And I don't think they're going to do that. So if we're going to offset the impact of tariffs, not to mention the political uncertainty that's also drying up investment. Every time Trump opens his mouth, there's another foreign investor that says, gee, I'm not going to put money into Canada to build a plant, to make things, to send them across the border. I think we have to get serious about rebuilding our infrastructure, and it's not just pipelines, it's rail, it's roads, it's ports, etc. Where's the money going to come from? Well, I think we have to get smart. The Germans have come to us not once but twice to talk about LNG for Germany. Why? Because one of the reasons why Germany is in such trouble economically today is because they lost their supply of cheap energy that came from Russia in the form of natural gas. They shut it off. And we know why they shut it off. We can say to them, absolutely, let's make a deal. You build the port. And you know the nice thing about ports? You can't move them once you build them, right? So they can finance it, they can pay for it, We don't have to look to Ottawa to pay for it. We can do the same with pipelines. We just got to get smart about it. The second thing I would say is, and I agree absolutely with John, let's just take a big, deep breath and separate the Sturm und Drang from Trump from what he actually does. He hasn't done anything yet, right? So wait and see what he does, and then react. It is going to come down to a negotiation. And the question we have to ask ourselves, to come back to what John said in terms of a strategy, is what are we prepared to put on the table, and what are we not prepared to put on the table? And I would submit that that will be time to play hardball, and we've got to start showing some spine when it comes to Donald Trump, and stop going down to Washington on our knees and pleading, and be very blunt with him. You want to rebuild America? You're not going to be able to do it without us. Why? Because we provide you with commodities, with capital goods, with intermediate goods that are absolutely essential to the rebuilding of America. And if you put tariffs on them, you're shooting yourself in the foot. We can also play hardball with him on supply management. We all know the Americans have their own version of supply management, and they're bloody hypocrites. Well, he has actually given us a lever for that negotiation. It's the principle of reciprocity that he invoked last week, that the United States will apply, quote, reciprocal tariffs on countries that have non-tariff barriers to trade. So we should say to him, we're happy to put supply management on the table, but you've got to put your subsidies on the table, and we can bring them down at the same time. There's no question that our dairy farmers and our poultry producers in Ontario and Quebec can give those pampered, subsidized Wisconsin farmers a great run for their money. Why? Because we've got land and we've got lots of water, and that's what you need for dairy, and you also need it for poultry. We've got it. There may be some adjustments, but we could be like New Zealand. New Zealand got rid of subsidies. They lost some of their preferential access many years ago, and they're major global producers because they became competitive. And guess what? We can do the same thing too. But it's going to come down to a negotiation. Similarly with automobiles, we can say to him, we're not going to buy another Big Three made car or truck if you put tariffs on us. You do a $5 billion business. And by the way, we can get them for half the price and better made from the Chinese. And we should be prepared to say that to him, to bring the point home. We're not doing him a favor. It's in their interest to do business with us. And they're not doing us any favors when we buy from them. To come to your question about defense, same thing. Let's stop talking about 2%. We know Trump isn't good with numbers anyway. So why do we keep throwing numbers at him? He likes to make a deal. So what should we say to him? We are about to embark on the biggest defense procurement program since the Cold War. And yes, we have a contract to buy those F-35s. I think we have a contract with Boeing. But we're going to cancel that program because we can buy the Viggen fighter from the Swedes at half the price, literally, and it's more reliable, which is true, than your F-35s, and it can do pretty much the same job. We should do the same with ships. And we could say, by the way, you have a shortage of heavy ice polar icebreakers. We're building 2 of them. We could build a lot more, and we could build them for you. Let's make a deal. That should be our approach. To come back to your question about strategy, John, we need to get more transactional. We need to be tougher. We need to stop talking about special relationships. As you said, those went out the window. It's about self-interest. We're going to continue to have to do business with the Americans. Aluminum tariffs, he's going to be buying that aluminum from Quebec because there's nowhere else he can get it at a competitive price because he's putting aluminum tariffs on everybody, or threatening to do so. And the United States does not have the capacity. So Americans are going to be paying that 25% tariff. And they're going to be squawking loudly in a couple of weeks if he goes through with it. So we need to understand that we do have leverage in this relationship. We're not patsies. And our politicians have to start showing some spine, real spine, and delivering tough messages to Washington.
So first I have to say, I look forward to Scott and Keith having us all back to talk about the future of supply management next year, now that Fenn opened that up. But before we do that, Paul, Fenn tells a really, I think, convincing story about we need to be stronger, we need to leverage, we need to advance our interests. But you've sat inside government, you sit outside of it now. Do we have the setting aside kind of the current political vacuum that we're in, that will go away, as John alluded, do we have the leadership in this country to do what Fenn just talked about?
Yes, great. So let me get to that. First of all, I'll say that if we all agreed, it wouldn't be a good panel, right? So I'm going to disagree with some things here, which I think is healthy.
Good.
I do agree with
It's not
lot
a
of
liberal debate.
things. Yeah, good stuff. So I think where I would agree is that the assumption is there's a limited runway here for the, let's call it the Trump agenda, right? There's already some indications of erosion of support and things, but there are also some indicators of support for the core agenda. But, on things like the inflation will come, there are going to be many headwinds, right? So it's not a forever thing. Where I would differ is on a couple of critical things. One is on the statement that he hasn't done much so far. I actually think if we had the data on investment flows, planned and actuals, you would have seen an impact already, because the threat of tariffs and the uncertainty around it is probably 70% of the way to actual tariffs, right, in terms of environment. So this continuing uncertainty is a big problem for us. Second assumption that I wouldn't agree with, and that I would, not to totally disagree, but I think things like F-18s or those things, it's not even clear those will actually be built, as opposed to autonomous, jets and things. We need to go where the puck is going on those things. Same thing will apply to naval vessels. Things are changing very, very quickly. There's actually a shipbuilding crisis in the United States right now because they're not sure what to do. So we're going to have a totally different go hard on some kind of new procurement, but it better be cutting edge. If it's old, we'll be sunk if we try to procure things from the Swedes or the Americans and some kind of old technology. So that, do we have the leadership to step up? I think, sadly, we don't right now. I mean, John was pretty clear that we've got a vacuum for the moment, right? So that's an unfortunate circumstance. There's all kinds of blame to go around. But more fundamentally, do we have the right leadership? I think there is a question of federalism here that is really quite worrying. I think on the internal trade, that everyone would agree, that's just a must-do. It's kind of a no-brainer, right? But yet, we can't do it. I would say the failure to do that now would be a leading indicator of a core dysfunction that's going to hold us back, right? So this is the time for premiers. Some of them are stepping up and say, I'll match if you match, but it's got to go beyond that. If that doesn't happen, it's not serious, right? It's not serious. So they didn't get the memo. That memo needs to get there. It's kind of like, yeah, we believe there's a problem, but we don't really believe it until we see the asteroid coming at us, right? Like, so that's why this needs to be taken very seriously, because we need some serious action. Final point that I would make is on tying up the diversification of markets and free trade agreements that we have with new infrastructure. It's got to be about better quality products as well, right? Like a lot of it, we have great stuff. I think agriculture and agri-food is one of the best sectors in Canada. Currently, I think medium term and longer term, like it's looking really good, right? But this could be a major headwind. You want to get ahead of the game here and become really competitive in a world where traceability really matters and like just cutting edge things where it's kind of been a nice to have and not necessary in the North American context, but the world may be changing quickly around us.
And Paul, when you think about things like interprovincial trade barriers and getting the memo, how many of the other things that we should be doing to respond to the U.S. should we be doing anyways, regardless of whether or not the tariffs come, that we just don't seem to be getting the memo about?
Yeah, well, it's like, I would say that, the 49th parallel, right? Like, that's the 49th, we should rename it as the 49th hip. We are joined at the hip, right? There is no option without the United States. Let's be crystal clear. There is no option, right? From an economic perspective, from a security option, we are joined at the hip, right? So, that there has to be a deal. Everyone else is saying we're going to have to make some compromise. I think it's more trade-offs. We need to leverage what we have that the U.S. needs, like critical minerals, things like that. You have to put those on the table simultaneously to try to break through on autos. We're not going to break through on autos on its own, right? So everything is going to be linked. I don't see a way around that. And so this is an all-in negotiation. I actually think that we should say, let's not negotiate the next CUSMA, which is going to be tough, right? Let's negotiate a North American agreement, which has a whole bunch of things in it, right? Even if it's not a formal document, like what is the strategy that links all these things? That's the way that I think Canada will succeed. And then a final thing is just a little Canadian nationalism, economic nationalism goes a long way. We've probably been too complacent in just kind of saying, I'll buy the best product. Let's make it a little more nationalistic. And maybe that could, that rivalry between provinces and things could actually have a kind of a positive element to it in some ways.
John, when we think about economic nationalism, the private sector plays a big role in that, should play a big role in that. But I think one of the structural issues that exists in this country today that impacts our place in the world is that we don't have as many Canadian leaders in the private sector as we used to have. We've got the banks, often proudly Canadian. In the ag space, we've got Nutrien and Maple Leaf and McCann's, your other kinds of partners. But you look across the sector, kind of that Canadian company, truly Canadian company, doesn't exist in the same way that it used to. Where does the private sector fit in this space, in this landscape, and how does that relate to that economic nationalism that Paul just talked about?
Yeah, what a great question. I mean, we have had a hollowing out of corporate Canada over the last over the last 20 years, but it isn't a gutting. It's more of a carving out, and we're trying to work with a range of truly Canadian companies to address this. It's important to note that among the characteristics of the Trump administration is a much greater interest and desire to work with corporate leadership on a whole range of topics, not just singular business issues. So we think that's an opportunity for corporate Canada and Canadian corporate leaders to stand up. Hopefully we can also go a bit that way in Canada as well, where there's been a bit of a kind of a swatting away of business voices over the last number of years. But Agri-Food is a real opportunity because some of our greatest companies and global companies are Agri-Food. You mentioned Richardson, McCann, Maple Leaf, and then a whole host that may not be household names that are big operators in the United States as well as Canada and many other markets. So that's an opportunity as we engage with the U.S. to have more of those Canadian voices in the conversation. Also, seeing, back to an earlier point I made about America's economic self-interest, which includes security of supply. So security, probably the word of the year, word of last year perhaps as well. So how do we, as we engage the United States in a new conversation, make it about our collective security? It's about energy security, resource security. It's about Arctic security, our perimeter. It's about border security. We're hearing these signals very loud and clear, and we can do a lot. We're already starting to do significant things, border security being an example, that are in our interest, but will enhance the security interests of North America. That should include food security. It's really interesting in RBC to see the number of firms we work with that export food, including manufactured food, to the U.S. on a very active basis. If you go around Pearson Airport in Toronto, that sea of warehouses, a good number of them are food production companies, food manufacturers, croissants, muffins, packaged salads, fantastic entrepreneurs who are helping to feed America. I think it's Walmart's biggest muffin supplier comes out of the Toronto area, and you know how price sensitive Walmart shoppers are. As the Trump administration starts to appreciate that, okay, so those Walmart shoppers are getting their muffins from Toronto, and that factory or that operation is not going to move to Detroit or Illinois overnight. There's a benefit there. Add to that the labor squeeze. So back to my point about demographics. This is not necessarily an acute issue right now, although it's probably going to become more acute before too long. As the U.S. tightens up immigration, and you probably hear this from your peers in the United States, we certainly hear it in our lending business in the U.S., it's one of the biggest concerns. If you're a meat packing plant, if you're a grower, you cannot get the people as easily as you could a number of years ago. That's a Canadian advantage. So as we think about that security arrangement, how do we show the United States, we can produce a lot of food, really high quality food, do it affordably, much better for the US to ship that out of Toronto or out of Manitoba than to try to get it by ship across an ocean. That's in the US interest. So how do we put all this together in a partnership discussion with the United States, and then say to that, what do we want in return? And I don't think Canada has articulated that. We've been so on the defensive here. We're offering up stuff, and it's an important moment over the coming months to also say, what do we want in return? Because, to Fenn's point, we have options. They may not be immediately appealing, but it's a big world. It's a growing world. Lots of other regions and countries want to work with Canada, trade with Canada, cooperate with Canada. I think the United States certainly does also want to maintain that relationship, but we can, we can be tough negotiators too.
I want to go back, John, to something you said a minute ago. You said these companies, the muffin manufacturer, can't move overnight. Canadian farmland can't move down south, but that plant could move down south one day. So if it's not overnight, but those tariffs are in place for 6 months or 12 months or 2 years,
Yep.
When do you start to worry that that plant does decide to shut down and move south?
Yeah, it's a slow drip, and I think it was Fenn who made the point that one of the big worries right now is the chill on investment, and we're seeing this. So just everyone holding up, not wanting to make a commitment today, given the uncertainty, perfectly understandable. But then how long does this environment continue where your next dollar of investment is going to be in the US rather than Canada? That would not be surprising if we see that. And then you get that further slow drip. So that factory doesn't go into a truck across the border overnight, but 5 years from now, suddenly you're making a lot less here than there, just given a good many, if not most, Canadian companies do have cross-border operations. So that needs to be one of the clear signals to Canada right now, that we have to quickly up our productivity and competitiveness game. We've been talking about this for years. It's painful to even mention the word productivity, but this is a clear signal. Productivity is just about competitiveness, of producing more with the same or even less. And we can do that in agri-food as well as other sectors. So what do we need across a host of regulations, taxes, human capital, technology to become much more productive across all our strategic sectors, agri-food being a key strategic sector and to export more, because that's a key way to drive productivity, to export more. And it's probably not going to be exporting huge amounts more to the United States. We're going to have to lean into overseas markets to get that export growth.
So go to Fed, but just a stat that I found interesting lately on productivity and agri-food manufacturing in Canada. If you looked at the sectors where there's been significant GDP growth from a food and bev manufacturing side, it's not been those that have seen the major increases in labor productivity. It's been those that have been able to export more to the United States. And we really can't overstate how critical that access to the United States market has been. But Fen, you wanted to make a point.
Two things we haven't talked about that are going to be very important going forward. One is our tax regime. Let's face it, you'll stay in Canada if it's a favorable tax regime. But if you think Trump, as he says he's going to do, is going to bring down their corporate tax to 15% from 21% where it is now, and that 15% is the same level as our corporate tax, we're going to have to go lower. And that's going to be tough politically, but if he's going to do it, that has been one of the reasons why businesses are in Canada, right? And so when businesses talk about jumping across the border or moving their operations to the United States, that's what they're looking at. I think the tariff war, quite frankly, is manageable. If you look at the history of every tariff war, they come to an end because finally politicians get their first lesson in economics and realize that this is dumb stuff, right? As the Wall Street Journal said in a big editorial headline, this is dumb stuff. And I think, we can say, yes, we agree on, manufactured goods coming from China. I mean, that's the threat. That's what Peter Navarro, who is sitting at Trump's right-hand side, that's what he's been generally focused on. It's not Canada, it's not Mexico. The concern about Mexico is Chinese investment going into Mexico or dumping steel through Mexico into the US market. So I think, that's a problem we face as well. We're on the same side of that one. The other thing we haven't talked about is labor markets. American agriculture is going to take a big hit as a result of Trump's deportation and go tough on immigration policies. And already you're hearing California farmers saying there's nobody to pick the lettuce. We have to be absolutely certain, because we also use lots of Mexican labor in our agricultural sector, that we don't go down that same path or are pressured to go down that same path, because that is going to affect us.
So I want to wrap up looking out a little bit further, and I'm going to ask Paul this question first. This is going to be a two-part question for everybody to try and type up. Paul, I'm going to go to you first because I was inspired by the podcast episode that you guys recently put out on super forecasting. And so this idea is, how do you do a better job thinking about what may come into the future? So I want to ask the three of you to think about a year, maybe 2 years down the road from now. What does Canada's place in the world look like? And can you give us one thing that Canada should be doing anyways to improve what that place looks like first? So first tell us, kind of based on how things are today, where you think we end up 2 years from now. And then what's one thing we can do to make it better? So Paul, go to you first on that.
Yeah, thanks for the shout out to Policy Prompt, the podcast. So the two things, 2 years is a short time period, right? So that's like tomorrow. But I would say I would agree with Fen on getting immigration strategically right for Canada is so important, right? And there's an opportunity to do that. We're kind of in a political funk on it. That includes temporary foreign workers. That is so important to the agriculture and agri-food sector. So that should be clear to politicians, as something they've got to get right. I think the second thing is getting our our technology positioning in order, right? There's again an opportunity to embrace some of the more advanced technologies, whether it's around artificial intelligence, like adoption at the small and medium size company level. Like it's work to do it, but there can be a lot of efficiencies and things that come out of it. So I'm pretty optimistic. I think it's going to take probably longer than 2 years. So I think it's a stretch, but the politicians need to be pushed hard on these. They tend to be focusing on lowest common denominators in many ways right now to just stay politically okay. I don't think they're showing as much ambition and vision as they should be, and they should be really pushed on that.
So Fen, when you look out 2 years, how do you see the world, and what can we do to make it better?
If we're going to trade more with the rest of the world, which I think we have to do, I think it's going to be important that we keep those pieces of the international economic order, namely the World Trade Organization, regardless of what the Americans do, quite frankly, but make sure that those institutions are supported and that other countries like ourselves, which have an interest in predictability, playing by the rules, ensuring that countries adhere to not just the rules of the international system, but the dispute resolution mechanisms of the international system, because you do get into trade disputes. So I think, speaking internationally, as we're thinking about, what parts of the small L liberal international economic order that was created out of the ruins of the Second World War, what pieces of that do we really want to invest some of our diplomatic energy to rescue from the house fire that's taking place south of the border? Because it's very much in our interest to do so as we look to other trading partners. With the United States, we're going to have to there's going to be a lot of triage there. I think it's doable, but I think when it comes to the international system, yes, we may be moving into sort of the Cold War world of geopolitics, but that world of rules, it wasn't there just because we like rules. It were rules that served our national self-interest. That's why you have rules. And so I think we're going to have to rescue some of that furniture.
And so, John, to you, where do you see us in 2 years, and what's one thing we can do to make that a better place?
So maybe this is a bit beyond 2 years, but as we see our traditional allies become older and more inward, and we're talking all about the United States, we should also be thinking about Germany. It's fascinating what it's going through, and we'll see the same in other, we're seeing it in other European countries, less, but we'll continue to likely see that. How do we remain younger and more outward? And one of the ways we do that is through immigration. So we are, for all our mistakes and missteps with immigration, we're still probably the best in the world at it. So let's maintain that. Let's continue to thoughtfully and strategically pursue immigration, especially economic immigration, but understand how that strengthens us and differentiates us, but also connects us with so many parts of the world that we need to trade with. So a huge advantage, and it's becoming less competitive because our competitors are taking themselves out of the game. Maybe that's just temporarily, but let's seize on that moment rather than panic or run with the herd there. So a nice point of differentiation there, even over the next 2 years. How do we think about distributing our population better? I think that's something we can also be more strategic with. We actually don't move around a lot, or not nearly enough as people. So lots of opportunities there. But post-secondary education, where we spend a lot of time at RBC, is one of the great mobility forces in society. So how do we think about our really strong colleges and universities and polytechnics as ways of moving people, about creating geographic, also social mobility in society, about integrating people, especially younger people, as they move here. International students has got a bad rap in the last couple of years, but there's also some really important and strong parts of it to us as an economy, including to the agri-food sector. So again, just take a breath. Look at the big chessboard of the world and think, what pieces can we move? Well, immigration, post-secondary are things entirely within our control. Donald Trump doesn't care about those. Let's continue to move those pieces in the next couple of years, because that was the question. But knowing that those pay 20-year dividends, because the things that were decisions made 20 years ago on immigration and on education are things that we benefit largely from today. So those are investments we can make today that will pay dividends in the 2030s and 2040s.
Great. So before I think to the panelists, I want to try and summarize a couple of points and try and drive something home that I've been thinking a lot about lately, which is, yes, we need to take a breath. And yes, we need to not light our hair on fire. But so much of the things that we need to do to make Canada a better place, we should be doing anyways. These are things often we've known for 20 years that we should be doing and fixing, and yet we haven't. Interprovincial trade barriers are not a new issue, and yet we've struggled to act on it. And so maybe I will use this hopefully to set up Tom's comments that are come after, and Tom will outline the strong, aggressive action plan that Agriculture Canada is going to take. But if he doesn't, I think we need to all take the opportunity to hold Tom and our politicians and our other elected leaders to account to say, look, the time is done for waiting around and reflecting and talking about what we need to do. We know what we need to do. We just need to get on with it. And so with that, I'd like to thank Fen and Paul and John and Aaron, who was with us earlier. And I will turn the floor back over to Keith.